Events change. People change. History changes. Human nature never does. This is History on Repeat.
An old man lies barely conscious beneath a wooden board. The board presses his cheek hard against the earth. His breathing is shallow. His body is disappearing under the weight of the stones piled above him. He can hear movement through the ground, muffled footsteps. Closer and closer they come. They stop beside him. He recognizes the shoes. The town sheriff. A heavy knot lands on the board above him, and another stone is placed on top. The rocks shift and grind before settling, and suddenly the pressure grows on his chest. His ribs tighten. His head sinks further into the soft earth. The weight builds so violently that, according to later accounts, his tongue is forced out of his mouth. The sheriff bends down, and he sees the old man's tongue protruding. Then, with his cane, he pushes it back into his mouth. The old man was Giles Corey, and in September 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, he was pressed to death beneath stones. You might think he had been accused of murder, or treason, or some other heinous crime that would warrant such a punishment. But Giles was accused of witchcraft, and he would not be the only one destroyed by that accusation. By the end of the Salem witch trials, more than 200 people had been accused. 19 were hanged. Giles Corey was pressed to death. Today we look at the Salem witch trials, and it almost seems like an impossible situation. A village that believed witches were working in evil ways among them, and a court that actually listened and took evidence of invisible spirits. People died of a crime that we know today does not exist. So before we try to understand Salem, before we talk about the children and the ministers in the courtroom and the evidence that was accepted, there is one question that hangs over the whole thing. What evidence did they think they even had? Or even better, how did they even verify who was a witch? Because obviously today there is no evidence of witchcraft, not in the sense that we would accept. There'd be no body, no weapon, no physical crime actually committed, and crucially, no actual witch to see and behold. And yet people actually believe this in a sense so strong that they were willing to condemn people to death. William Kingdon Clifford said in 1877, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." And when you hear something like that, and you hear what happens at Salem, it sounds obvious. Of course we should have evidence for our beliefs, especially when the claims that we're making are extraordinary. Extraordinary claims should require extraordinary evidence. And if you're going to crush somebody under a pile of rocks, you should definitely have evidence for what you believe. And that feels like a very modern standard. That feels like the line between reason and madness. This is where the problem really begins, because while we all would agree with that statement, none of us actually live by perfect evidence. We believe things personally without verifying them all the time. Think about something as ordinary as a cereal bar or a protein bar. You pick it up, you look at the label, you read what's on the back, and you see X amount of grams of protein or sugar or calories or whatever nutritional information you're looking for, and you believe it. But you didn't stand beside the assembly line counting and weighing everything, and you didn't send your cereal bar off to the lab for testing. Yet you trust the information on the back of that cereal bar. And we do this constantly with food, with doctors. We take their word for things, with science, with the news. Even when we take our car to the mechanics, we trust that they're not going to make up a problem, and we trust that the problems they do tell us are real. But then we're left with the option of not believing anything until it's proven to us, and nobody can live like that. And this is where belief is a strange thing, because Salem shows us that something can feel believable without earning our belief. But what happens when someone does have evidence, though, and strong evidence, measurable evidence? Is that enough to make people believe? To find out, I think we need to explore the other side of the belief coin. And we need to begin with a different story before we can return to Salem. A young man moves quickly through the cobblestone streets with his pregnant wife beside him. Every few steps she slows. Another contraction. Sharp, excruciating pain. He steadies her, and then they keep moving. The baby is coming, and they need to reach the hospital. Around them, Vienna carries on as normal. Carts rolling over stones, voices moving through the streets, people going about their day. But for this couple, everything has narrowed down to one thing: get to the hospital in time. The year is 1847, and the hospital they are approaching is Vienna General Hospital, one of the greatest medical institutions in all of Europe. They pass through the gates. Inside, she is admitted to the first maternity clinic, Clinic 1. He kisses her goodbye, and he is told to wait outside. Hours pass. Then finally, a cry. A baby, alive and healthy. Everything they had hoped for. The father holds his child for the first time, and for a moment, the fear lifts. His wife has survived the birth, and the baby is alive and healthy, and their new life has begun. Or so he thinks. The next day, she develops a fever. At first, maybe no one panics. Childbirth is a violent experience to go through. Bodies are exhausted, pain, weakness, bleeding, fever. None of it would have seemed completely impossible after labor. But then the fever climbs, and she begins to shiver violently. Her abdomen swells. The pain gets worse. Doctors come and go, and they try what they know. Nothing works. Within days, the woman who had walked into the hospital is dead. The child survives, and the father doesn't leave with his family. He leaves with a newborn and a question. What happened? Doctors had a name for it: childbed fever. But a name isn't an explanation. A name can make something sound understood. It can make a mystery feel contained, but it doesn't tell you why a healthy young woman can give birth in one of Europe's leading hospitals and die just days later. And this isn't the only woman this happens to. This happens again and again and again. Women would survive the actual childbirth, but after a day or two would start developing a fever. Some would die within days and some would suffer longer, but the pattern was always the same. People knew the name, childbed fever, but the cause wasn't known, and no one could stop it. The strangest thing is, though, at Vienna General Hospital, there's another detail that turns it into a puzzle. There's two maternity clinics at Vienna General Hospital treating the same kind of patients with the same procedures under the same roof, and women died in both. But between the two clinics, they didn't die at equal rates. The second clinic had a death rate that was frightening, but survivable. The first clinic was something completely different. The first clinic was feared, and it wasn't some hidden statistic that only the hospital and the doctors knew. People around the city knew about this. Women knew, families knew. Some women reportedly begged not to be even admitted to the first clinic, and some were so frightened that rather than being admitted to that clinic, they'd rather give birth in the streets. Think about that, a woman in labour in 19th century Vienna looking at one of the best hospitals in Europe and deciding that the street is a better option. That's how frightening the first clinic had become. So something was happening there, something real. Women were dying at an extraordinary rate. Families were being broken. And the answer had to be somewhere. For the doctors in 19th century Vienna, though, witches were not the answer. The answer lay somewhere in the difference between the two clinics. And one person who was trying to spot that difference was a young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, and he just could not leave that question alone. Why was Clinic 1 so much deadlier than Clinic 2? It's the same hospital, as we've said, it's the same city, the same kind of patients. The difference was too large to ignore. So Semmelweis began looking, and not in a casual way. He became consumed by the difference between these two, and it was almost for him like playing a game of spot the difference. And he compared everything you can think of, the rooms, the routines, the staff, things like religious practices, the timing of admissions, the way that the women were positioned during labour, all sorts of crazy stuff. Anything that might be able to explain why one was so much worse than the other. But the deeper he looked, the deeper the mystery became, because the dangerous clinic was staffed by trained physicians and medical students, men that were trained in anatomy, pathology, and medical theory, people who were supposed to represent the future of medicine and represent the current state of medicine. But Clinic 2, the safer one, was actually ran by just midwives, and yet those midwives were losing less mothers. And that's no shot at midwives. On paper, the doctors should have been safer. In reality, they should have been the ones that had the higher level of education, the higher training, especially for this time period, training with pathology and anatomy, whereas the midwives tended to do a more practical form of training, which was purely just in the hospitals. But the reality of the situation was the one that was ran by the doctors was the one that women feared. Soon, though, the mystery would leave a small clue for him, and that clue came in the form of death. The doctors and the medical students at Vienna General Hospital were no strangers to death, and in fact, death was a part of their training. Part of their training required them to go into the autopsy room where they studied the dead, they handled and dissected corpses, and then later they would leave the autopsy room and walk into the maternity ward. And every day the doctors moved between these two locations. At the time, that didn't seem strange at all. It was just part of their medical training. They look and work on cadavers while they're training and learning about anatomy and things like that. And that was and still is how doctors learn. One of the men working inside that autopsy room was a professor named Jakob Kulaks, and he was a close friend and colleague of Semmelweis's. And while he was working one day, teaching students inside of this autopsy room, he received a small puncture wound from one of his students' scalpels on his finger. The wound was tiny. It's the kind of injury that, we've all had, those annoying small cuts on the end of a finger from whatever caused it, be it a knife or a scalpel in this case. But over the coming days, Kulaks became violently ill. Fever, chills, inflammation, delirium. The infection spread right the way through his body. And on March 13th, 1847, just 2 weeks after the puncture wound, Jakob Kulaks was dead. Semmelweis was shocked and devastated. But as he read through his friend's post-mortem report, something stood out. The symptoms were familiar, too familiar. Kulaks' illness looked disturbingly similar to the illness killing the mothers in Clinic 1. The fever, the inflammation, the way the body seemed to turn against itself. And that's when the horrifying possibility began to occur to Semmelweis. If a wound from a contaminated scalpel could kill Kulaks, and if Kulaks' illness resembled childbed fever, then maybe the mothers weren't dying from bad air or bad luck or some mysterious atmosphere in the ward. maybe something was being carried from the dead to the living, from the hands of doctors to the bodies of the mothers. And that possibility is horrifying because it means that death had come disguised as a doctor. Today this seems super obvious. If you've been handling and cutting open dead bodies, wash your hands before touching women that are giving birth, right? Of course. But it only feels obvious because we know something in hindsight that they didn't. We know about germs and bacteria. We know about invisible things that can make us sick. They didn't. Not in the same way that we do anyway. Doctors in the 1840s could see dirt, of course. They could see blood, they could see grime, and they washed their hands to remove those things. What they couldn't see was the thing that mattered the most, and that was germs and bacteria. Semmelweis didn't have germ theory, but he did have a theory. There was one detail that he couldn't really ignore, and that was the smell. Because even after the doctors had washed their hands with soap and water after leaving the autopsy room, the smell of the dead often remained on their hands. And that bothered him, because if the smell was still lingering after washing, something invisible could still be lingering. And Semmelweis gave that invisible thing a name, and he called them cadaverous particles. If there is something invisible on the hands, even after washing them with soap, how do you remove it? And how do you know when it's gone if you can't see it? This is where Semmelweis did something crucial. He didn't just produce another theory or another idea about what the cause could be, because there was already many of those. Things like bad air, atmosphere, miasmas were very popular during this time period. Ideas that sounded plausible in the medical world at the time, but Semmelweis needed more than just a theory that sounded convincing. He needed something to test against reality, to see if his theory was actually true or not. So in May in 1847, he ordered every single physician and medical student entering the maternity ward to wash their hands in chlorinated lime solution before they began examining patients. And chlorinated lime was something that was strong enough to remove the smell of the cadavers. And if the smell was gone, Semmelweis believed that whatever else was lingering were gone too. And then he let it play out. And what he saw next was extraordinary, because before chlorinated lime washing was introduced, the first clinic had been terrifying, right? That's the one everyone was scared of. But after the new rule came in, the death rate in that clinic absolutely collapsed. Before Semmelweis introduced chlorinated lime disinfection, 459 women had died in the first clinic in 1 year. 2 years later, after the procedure had been rigorously implemented, only 45 women died in 1 year. So the mortality rate had dropped from an 11.4% rate to a 1.2%. Sometimes when you say statistics like that, numbers can sound cold, 11.4%, 1.2%, but you have to remember every one of those numbers, every one of those 459 women that died was a mother or a wife or a sister. Remember the man in the beginning looking down at his baby without his wife. And now that very same ward that killed that woman had become safer than the other clinic run by the midwives. So Semmelweis hadn't just found an idea, he'd found a solution that saved lives. Semmelweis wasn't out of the woods just yet, because soon reality would push back against his theory just a little bit. One day, a woman with advanced cervical cancer was admitted to the ward. Staff examined her, and then they moved on and examined other women. And yet, in the days that followed, childbed fever swept through the ward. But this time there hadn't even been an autopsy or a corpse involved, so there couldn't have been any cadaverous particles. And that's the basis for Semmelweis's entire theory. Remember, the theory is that something is passing from the dead to the living. That's why they're called cadaverous particles. But here, there is no dead body. And now he's faced with a choice. He can either protect the theory that he'd worked so hard to build, or he could follow the evidence. And to his credit, he followed it. Maybe whatever was causing childbed fever didn't only come from the dead. Maybe it could be carried from the living to the living, from one sick patient to another. So Semmelweis changed the explanation. Not completely, he didn't completely throw out the theory, but he changed it meaningfully enough that the explanation was altered. Rather than forcing the evidence to fit his theory, he altered the theory to fit the evidence. Reality had spoken, and Semmelweis had listened. The impressive thing isn't just that Semmelweis was willing to pivot. To me, the most impressive thing is that he was willing to be wrong. The question now is whether the rest of the medical field would be willing to do the same thing. The evidence was there, the results were there, the lives were being saved, but the experts in the medical field weren't entirely convinced by Semmelweis's new theory or by Semmelweis's results. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because we can start to see now people resisting good evidence. And these doctors who are resisting him aren't stupid men. They're not ignorant peasants waving away science because they don't understand the world around them. They're educated people, experienced men of science, men of medicine. Many of these men have dedicated their whole entire lives to healing the sick. So if evidence wasn't enough to convince these men, then what would? Part of the answer is something that we often forget about evidence. Evidence never arrives into empty minds. It arrives into a mind already filled with its own assumptions. Those doctors have their own training, their own experience, their own reputation. They've also inherited medical theories from those who came before them, a whole way of understanding disease, and most importantly, their own pride. So they weren't looking at Semmelweis's work and his evidence from a neutral position. They were looking at him through the world that they believed that they understood. And from inside that world, his explanation probably sounded crude. Maybe some people even viewed it as insulting to more senior physicians who had more of a commanding presence within the medical field, because Semmelweis isn't just saying, I've found a better procedure. You've got to remember what he's saying. He's saying the problem may be on your hands. Literally, doctors who have built and constructed their whole identity on saving people to accept that they might be carrying death into the maternity ward. That's a brutal thing to ask someone to believe about themselves. And there is another slight problem as well. He could show the death rates falling, and he could show that more women were surviving, but he couldn't explain why they were surviving. He couldn't explain bacteria or germ theory in a way that doctors that came later would be able to. He could point to his results, but he couldn't give a full scientific explanation. So the people around him, the doctors around him, his evidence was powerful, but his explanation wasn't fully complete just yet. And before we judge the doctors for not believing Semmelweis too harshly, we need to remember something, that we have the benefit of hindsight. We know the truth now. They were making decisions in the fog of uncertainty. There is no history book open in front of you telling you who the good guys will be and who the bad guys will be and who will later be vindicated. There's only the side that seems right with the information that you know at the time. And that's one of the things that actually fascinates me the most about history. And it's not the outcomes of history, it's the decisions. The moment where someone is standing in a moment of uncertainty and they have to choose what they believe. I often wonder if, given the same knowledge, surrounded by the same assumptions, facing the same pressure, how many of us would believe Semmelweis and how many of us would have rejected him? For Semmelweis, years of watching something he believed was saving lives fail to receive the acceptance that he thought the evidence demanded. Semmelweis became more combative, more public in his anger, and his reputation suffered. And gradually, so too did his mind. By the 1860s, the man who had once approached the problem with such curiosity, with such patience, appeared increasingly consumed by that very problem. The debate had become personal. The resistance exhausted him. In 1865, 20 years after his discovery, Ignaz Semmelweis was committed to an asylum. He was 47 years old. Within weeks, he was dead from sepsis. The same process that follows childbed fever. It's one of history's crueler ironies. The man who had spent so long trying to stop infection from killing mothers died in the shadow of infection himself. Years later, the work of men like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister would give medicine the scientific foundation that Semmelweis never had, and the invisible world that he suspected became even easier to see. Germs, bacteria, infection, the language finally arrived. And medicine eventually moved in the direction that Semmelweis had been pointing to all along. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see that vindication, but now today, we do look back on Semmelweis as someone who was ahead of his time. Semmelweis is one of those stories that show the danger of being right too early, not right before the evidence existed, but right before enough people were willing to accept what the evidence demanded of them. And that came at a cost to his career, a cost to his reputation, maybe even a cost to his sanity. Vienna shows us the pain of evidence being accepted too slowly. Salem shows us the danger of evidence being accepted too quickly, the cost of becoming certain before you have the right to be certain. So now, having answered what happens when evidence is doubted, we can now return to Salem. Earlier we asked what evidence the villagers thought they had. The answer is they thought they had more evidence than they actually did, but they didn't think they had no evidence. To understand why, we have to go back to the very beginning, before Giles Corey was pressed to death beneath stones, before the hangings, to a house in Salem that had the first case of witchcraft, the house of Reverend Samuel Parris. Inside that house, two young girls became the center of a mystery no one could explain. Parris's daughter, Betty, and his niece, Abigail Williams, cried out, twisted and contorted on the floors. They complained of invisible pain. They called a doctor, and he came and he examined them. Many accounts identify this doctor as a man by the name of William Griggs. But as he began to examine the girls, when every ordinary explanation began to fail, another explanation began to take shape, that the girls were under what he called an evil hand. To us, it might sound like illness or something psychological, but they weren't standing in our world, they were standing in theirs. And in their world, the invisible wasn't automatically imaginary. Salem was a Puritan community, and for Puritans, the Bible wasn't a book of private belief. It was a framework through which reality was understood. The Bible doesn't describe a separate supernatural world sitting somewhere far from ordinary life. It describes ordinary life, where God is active and the devil is active, sin had consequences, and angels appear. Witches weren't some fictional character, they belonged in a reality where the supernatural was possible. So when the young girls began to cry out in pain, twisted on the floor, complaining of something that nobody else can see, the people around them weren't choosing between a modern medical explanation and a fantasy. They were trying to understand what was happening inside the only world they know. And that wasn't a doctor inventing a new theory out of nowhere, some strange Puritan doctor coming up with something. By 1692, the idea of witchcraft already had a long history behind it. Europe had lived through generations of witch trials where tens of thousands had died, sermons had been preached, even laws had been created regarding witchcraft as a real crime. So when a doctor in Salem spoke of an evil hand, it didn't land as madness. That doesn't make Salem right. It's not that they had this medical explanation so it's right, but it helps explain why it didn't feel like a random thing to the people inside of the village of Salem. The girl's suffering wasn't just suffering, it was a clue. Their pain would become evidence, proof that something invisible was attacking them. And if something invisible was attacking the children, then someone had to be responsible. Someone needed to shoulder the blame. And the first people that were named were people that were already on the fringes of the Salem village, if you will. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Three women, three very vulnerable targets. When a community is frightened and looking for evil, it often finds it in the first place people already distrust. Sarah Good, for example, was poor. She was a beggar, someone people already looked at with a level of suspicion. Tituba was a slave in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, and Sarah Osborne was an older woman who already had tension around her name. Years earlier, she'd been married to a man named Robert Prince, and when Robert Prince died, his will left his farm to his young sons when they came of age. Until then, Sarah had continued managing the farm. She also later remarried, and by the time those sons had come of age, Sarah had been managing the farm for about 15 years at the cost of her health because she had to do a lot of the work herself. And so she probably felt quite entitled to the property that her husband had died and left her to look after. And over time, a dispute began to grow around the estate's ownership between Sarah and the sons. Someone else who was involved in this dispute was a man called Thomas Putnam, and he came from a very influential family in Salem, and he was one of Robert Prince's friends. So Thomas Putnam and his family are no stranger to Sarah Osborne, and we can start to see how she can look like a fringe character. And then when witchcraft accusations begin, Thomas Putnam is one of the men who helps the two girls with Reverend Samuel Parris bring the accusations forward to the authorities. And I don't want to overstate this. We can't simply say that Thomas Putnam accused Sarah Osborne because of land, because it's not that simple. What we can say is that once Salem begins looking for witches, old tensions could change the shape of people's former actions. A woman who was once a difficult widow involved in a land dispute starts to look like a part of something darker. The thing is, Sarah didn't become a different person though. The accusations made against her cast her motives in a whole new light. So following all of that, the three accused are then brought before the magistrates, and Sarah Osborne denied all of it. She denied using witchcraft, she denied hurting the children. Salem is a bit of a different animal to Semmelweis because where the standard of evidence was too high in the Semmelweis story, the standard of evidence in Salem is very poor. Because let's say someone accuses you of attacking them with your body, you can answer where you were, who you saw, what you were doing at the time the crime was committed. But in Salem, often the only evidence that was presented was the accusation itself, just the girl saying somebody had done it. And on top of that, the accusation isn't that you did it, it's that your spirit did it. How do you disprove something that's invisible? That's the power of the evidence they were using in Salem, and it was called spectral evidence or a spectral witness. And that spectre is invisible to everyone but the person being attacked. Once the court accepts that kind of evidence, the accused are trapped because having an alibi proves nothing. You can be one place and your spirit can be somewhere else. A witness can say, she wasn't there in body, but she was there in spirit. And now the old cycle begins. Someone already marginal becomes accused. The accusation gives their actions a new meaning. Their poverty, their conflict, their anger, absence from church because of ill health, whatever it might be, starts to look like evidence. And then something else happened in this whole saga that solidified the perpetuating cycle. Sarah Good denied it, Sarah Osborne denied it, but Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Samuel Parris's house, confessed to witchcraft. And her confession wasn't just to say, yes, I'm a witch. She described a wider, invisible world, other witches, the devil. And for the people listening, it didn't shrink the panic. It expanded it, because if Tituba was telling the truth, then Salem wasn't dealing with the one strange illness. It was dealing with a hidden network of witches. Every new accusation feels like a new discovery. That's the moment that this expands beyond 3 accused women into hundreds of accused people. And before long, some of the most prominent people in Salem were under the microscope. And as the circle of accused expanded from 3 people to 100 people to then over 200 people, people started to doubt what was going on. Because 3 witches seems fairly reasonable, but 200 witches? And it's not because everybody in Salem woke up one morning and stopped believing in witches, or suddenly got some modern standard of evidence. The doubt grew because a leading Puritan minister named Increase Mather, a man who actually believed witches were real himself, warned the courts against relying on something like spectral evidence. In fact, he makes a great point. He argues that it would be better for suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned to death. And by the end of October in 1692, the special courts were dissolved and the panic began to break. Unfortunately, too late for the 20 people who would lose their lives on evidence that should never have been enough for a death sentence. And when you sit with Salem for long enough, it is easy to think the lesson is simple. Bad evidence is dangerous, weak evidence is dangerous, believing too quickly is dangerous. And all of that is true, but there's another part of belief that we need to think about. Because when we talk about belief, we often imagine someone standing there between 2 options, almost like both choices are laid out in front of them. This explanation or that explanation, this side or that side. And then we imagine them weighing it up and seeing what seems most convincing. In Salem, that choice was warped by fear and theology, the Bible, authority, testimony. But there was still, at least in principle, a competing question. Are these girls sick, or are they afflicted by witches? Is this evidence strong enough, or is the court trusting something that it shouldn't? Eventually, that second question did break through. People like Increase Mather didn't have to stop believing witches existed to doubt the evidence being used. They could still say, I believe witchcraft is real, but this standard of evidence is poor, and it's not enough to kill somebody on. Even inside the world of Salem, there is still some room for doubt, some room for correction. But what happens when that room gets closed? What happens when people aren't standing between 2 clear options, 2 clear choices? What happens when one side of the comparison has been completely hidden before they even get the chance to take it seriously? Sometimes belief doesn't come from between 2 open doors. Sometimes there's only one door that you're allowed to see. And nowhere is that clearer than in the Soviet Union. While I was researching for this episode, I came across a story from a very different world. It comes from a memoir by a German officer fighting deep inside of the Soviet Union in 1943. He finds himself quartered in the home of a Russian woman. And that makes the story interesting because she wasn't this person his ideology had taught him to expect. The Nazi ideology, of course, expected him to believe that Slavic people were subhumans and stupid. But this lady wasn't. She was educated. She was intelligent and thoughtful. She even spoke fluent German and had a university degree. In other words, she was a real thinking person. And she told him about life inside of the Soviet Union, the hardship, the hunger, the people who had seemingly disappeared out of nowhere, friends, neighbors, sometimes family members, people who were there one day and gone the next. So she wasn't blind to the suffering. She knew life was hard. She knew people were hungry. She knew people disappeared. But then he began describing life outside of the Soviet Union to her. The towns he'd seen, the standard of living across Europe, the idea that ordinary people elsewhere might be living in more comfort, more freedom, more choice. And this is the part that stayed with me. She struggled to believe that that was even going on elsewhere. Not because she was stupid or incapable of understanding that people somewhere else might live better lives, but because nothing in her world had prepared her to believe it. And I think that's really important because the question isn't whether she thought Soviet life was perfect. She clearly didn't. She had her quarrels with it. The better question is, what did she think life was like everywhere else? If the only story you've ever been given is that the outside world is worse and that capitalism is crueler and that workers are exploited far more than in the Soviet Union, it'd be like being told, for example, that Australia is a cold, snowy country, that it's miserable and that everybody hates living there. And then one day you meet someone from Australia and they tell you, no, it's warm, it's beautiful. People go to the beach, the sun is out most of the year. You might not immediately believe them, not because you're stupid, but because what they're describing doesn't fit the information that you've been given. And we don't always verify the information we've been given, do we? That's what makes controlled information so powerful. It doesn't need to convince everyone that life is good. Sometimes it only needs to convince them that everywhere is worse than where they are. Just a few years prior to the German soldiers' encounter in the Soviet Union conducted the 1937 census, and like any other country, it was counting its population, where people lived, how many citizens were there, how the country was changing, all that boring stuff. But a census isn't supposed to be ideological, it isn't supposed to be propaganda. It's just counting how many people are there. That should be one of the simplest questions that a country can ask. And the answer should be relatively straightforward too. But as the numbers were gathered up and added up, something was wrong. The population was lower than it was supposed to be, and not just by a little bit. There were millions of absences sitting there in the figures. Where did they all go? The census workers themselves would soon find out. And that's the terrifying part. The census didn't just reveal missing people, it created new suspects. The people counted as missing were one problem. The people who counted them became another. Because the numbers were very revealing of what the Soviet Union had been doing the past few decades. The census was suppressed, the results were treated as harmful, and the people connected to producing those numbers now carried that harmful information. Think about how insane that is. These people hadn't led some kind of counter-revolution against the Russian state. They hadn't attacked the state. They just counted. That was the crime. And this was the job that they had been asked to do by the government. What were they supposed to do? Refuse? That would be worse in the Soviet Union, for sure. But in the logic of the system, the problem couldn't be the party and its policies. The problem had to be the enemy. The census must have been sabotaged. If the numbers embarrassed the party, then the people who produced the numbers became suspicious. Senior statisticians were arrested. People were blamed as enemies. You might just be the one who counts the missing, or you might be the one who files the report. You might just be someone who asked, hey, why aren't these figures adding up? And it becomes a whirlwind. A label attaches to one person, and the people around them start getting pulled towards it. Your neighbor is denounced, your father says the wrong thing, and somehow now you have the problem too. That's what terror does. It doesn't just punish the guilty, it makes everyone ask, how close am I to something dangerous? How close am I standing to someone dangerous? The millions of missing in the census would have been all too familiar with this pattern. You see, by the late 1920s and early 1930s, 10 or so years before the census, Stalin was trying to force the Soviet Union into the modern industrial world at a brutal speed. Factories had to be built, cities had to be fed, and to feed the workers in those cities, the state needed grain, huge amounts of grain, and someone had to grow that grain. Millions of peasants across the Soviet Union, especially in places like Ukraine, were pushed off their land and into collective farms. Then the government set grain quotas, and the state demanded that those quotas be met. It didn't care whether they were actually possible or not. It was just trying to force it to happen no matter what. The peasants couldn't meet those quotas, let alone meet them and feed their own families. And what happened is people began to starve. Some took tiny amounts of grain for themselves, and when even that was punished, when you can't feed yourself after feeding the country, when the land you worked that might have been in your family since God knows when has been taken from you, people don't like that and they start resisting. And that's what many peasants did. They slaughtered cattle, they hid grain, they resisted, they destroyed crops. When quotas weren't met, when resistance spread, and the party is faced with famine, food shortages, bread lines in the industrial cities, now the party has a choice, much like Semmelweis had a choice. The party could admit that the policy was failing, or it could find someone to blame for the shortages. And that someone was the Kulak. Officially, a kulak was supposed to be a wealthier peasant, someone richer, but in practice, the label could stretch to whatever Stalin and the people in the Kremlin wanted it to mean. Someone who owned slightly more than his neighbor, or someone who resisted collectivization because they didn't want to be forced off the land they owned, or even someone who was convenient for local officials to blame. And once that label of a kulak was attached to you, your life could change overnight. Your home could be seized. Your family could be deported. You could disappear into the machinery of the state, into the gulags. So when the quotas aren't met and the workers in the city are wondering, why are there food shortages? The party doesn't have to say, our policies has helped create this. It already had a story ready. The kulaks. And in the logic of the Soviet system, they weren't treated as innocent absences from the census. They were folded into the story of enemies that the party had built. Some were denounced by others, some were simply in the wrong place when the state came looking for grain. That was the genius and the horror of the explanation. It could absorb almost anything. The kulaks had just one piece of the puzzle. Most people were missing from the count because they'd starved to death, slowly and painfully. And this brings us back to the question of comparison. Who is left to tell the story when millions are dead? What story does our Russian woman have to compare with? If people who have suffered disappeared, if the people who counted them had disappeared, if the people who went missing for a whole slew of other reasons disappeared, then where does the competing version of the story come from? In Salem, there was still enough room for a rational man like Increase Mather to say, is this evidence strong enough to warrant killing people? But Stalin's Soviet Union, that space for that kind of question was long gone. You could doubt quietly, you could notice quietly, you could whisper to someone you trust, maybe. But unless you want to end up missing too, you learn to mind your own business. And that's what makes controlled evidence so powerful. It doesn't just tell you what to believe, it removes the people, the facts, and the comparisons that might have allowed them to believe something else. Every person and every point of comparison is a piece of the puzzle, and if nobody has all the pieces, nobody can put the picture together. And those pieces matter because those are the things we use to form opinions and beliefs about the world around us. Ultimately, I think most of us are trying to find the truth, or at least I hope we are. And that's something that David Hume was trying to point to in an inquiry concerning human understanding. Much of what we believe is not built on certainty. It's built on things like experience from the past, habit, repetition, authority, testimony from others, inferences from other experiences. Take something as basic as the sun rising tomorrow, for example. We know why the sun appears to rise. We understand the rotation of the earth. We understand the pattern. And we can reasonably say that the sun will rise tomorrow. In fact, I'd be willing to bet my house on it. I'm not sure of it. But still, that belief rests on nothing but assumption that tomorrow will behave exactly like every other day that we've known. The sun rose yesterday. It rose the day before. It has risen as long as human beings have been around on the earth. And we infer from that repetition that it will rise again. And most of the time it's perfectly reasonable for us to infer that. But it's still not the same as being absolutely certain that it will. If something catastrophic happened in the night, if the conditions changed suddenly, then the pattern we trust could fail. And we do this constantly, right down to the cereal bars we eat, remember? The label tells us what's in it and we believe it. Not because we personally tested it in a lab, but because we trust the chain of people and the system that put that information on the back of the cereal bar. That's the point. Every piece of information we have, every memory, every testimony, every authority, every pattern that we've learned to trust becomes part of the puzzle of truth. And you can see that all the way through this episode. Salem was missing the real evidence piece. The girls were suffering, the village was afraid, but the evidence was never proving that witches were responsible. Semmelweis and the doctors in Vienna were missing the germ theory piece. They had numbers, they had stats, but they didn't yet have the full invisible world that would later make sense of it all. And it cost them. It cost everybody in that story. And in the Soviet Union, whole pieces of the puzzle are missing. On purpose, facts were hidden, evidence was punished, people disappeared, alternative explanations were removed entirely before ordinary people could properly compare them. And maybe that's what William Kingdon Clifford was pointing at when he said, "It is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." Maybe he wasn't trying to set an impossible standard for anybody to live up to. Maybe he was warning us about the danger of forming beliefs too easily and then letting those beliefs harden before we have enough pieces of the puzzle. I think the moral of Clifford's warning isn't that belief itself is the problem. We have to believe. We have to trust. We have to rely on other people. We don't have a choice in that. The moral is that what we choose to believe, the things we choose to accept, what we go along with, has consequences, not just for us, but for everybody around us. Think about how far the consequences spread around those doctors from the choice that they were making to look past the evidence. Belief shouldn't be won too easily, but certainty shouldn't come too cheaply either. Remember the Putnams? Their daughter, Anne Putnam, was one of the biggest accusers in all of Salem. She had an accusation toward every single one of the people who was killed in Salem. So this is a girl whose accusations helped send people to their deaths. 14 years after the trials in 1706, Anne stood before the church. She was no longer a child, she was a woman. and she asked for forgiveness from God, from the families of the people who had suffered. She admitted that she had wrongfully accused innocent people. Imagine carrying that from the age of 12 into adulthood, knowing that what you believed, what you said, what people accepted from you had helped destroy lives and families. That's the cost. It's not belief itself that's the problem. It's certainty without humility, certainty without enough evidence, certainty that forgets it might be wrong. And that's why Semmelweis matters, because when reality pushed back against his theory, he changed the theory. That's why increased matter matters, because even though he still believed witches were real, he could still ask whether evidence was strong enough to kill people. And maybe that's the kind of humility belief needs. Not the kind that says, nothing is true, I don't accept anything unless I can verify it myself, but the kind that leaves the door open for correction. The kind that asks, what should change my mind? What would change my mind? Where does the evidence stop, and where does my inference, my assumptions begin? Maybe evidence becomes dangerous when we forget how much of the puzzle we're missing. So that's where I want to leave this episode, not with the question, how could they believe that, but with something much more personal, dear listener. Is there anything we, meaning you and I, believe now? Anything that feels obvious to us that people in 150 years might look back on and ask, how did they believe that? This has been History on Repeat, and as always, the past has more to say if we're willing to listen.